Hey, this is a walkthrough of the AQA GCSE Computer Science Paper 2 Specimen paper. So this wasn't a real paper, this was produced just as an example of what a real paper would look like. I've exam board in 2015, but it's still useful to practice even though there aren't any grade boundaries to compare your mark to. So the crucial information here is that it's an hour and a half, which is standard for GCSEs, I think, it's an hour and a half. It's also worth 80 marks. And things like you can't use a calculator and you've got to use black ink. So this out of the two papers is the more written paper, both are theoretical, but this is slightly more written, so lots of longer mark answers which you either like or hate. And if you don't know, there's a playlist on my channel which covers all the theory needed for this paper, so you can revise that playlist if you want to. And if the video is useful, if walkthroughs like this are helpful, please like it and subscribe, it really helps me out. And otherwise, let's get started. Firstly, we have a bit pattern shown here, and we've got to convert it into decimal. So binary number, we've got to convert it into decimal. So the way I would do this is to do, and let's zoom in so we can do this without having to repeat it. I like to do a little table. So in reality, these columns are representing 1, 2, that's way too thick. Anyway, these are going to be 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, write that in, and 128. So the zeros aren't counting, so we've basically got one lot of 64 here, one lot of 8, one lot of 4, one lot of 2, and so we add this up: 72, 76, 78, so the answer is 78. Next we have to convert the bit pattern into hexadecimal. So we could do this in two ways. We could either just use 78, or we could do it the way I would prefer to do it, which is a better kind of method to use, is to separate it out. So the good thing about hexadecimal is, or the reason why it's used, is because it corresponds to 4 bits. So basically we can look at each 4 bits individually as opposed to looking at the whole number. Although of course we could just do this because we've kind of done half the work already. But let's say we didn't have this, we'd have to do an extra step otherwise. So first of all, we want to look at each one and work out what this value is. So this is effectively, if we ignore what column it would actually be, this is the same as saying one lot of 4. So this is 4, this nibble is 4 in decimal, and this is going to be 14 in decimal. Then we can work out what this is in hexadecimal. So hexadecimal shares 0 to 9 with decimal, and then the remaining 6 are from A, B, C, D, E, F, so we'll work to 15, and so 14, so 10 to 15, and then so 14 is 1, 2, 3, 4, so it's E. So this is just 4 in hexadecimal, so this is base 10, and 4 in hexadecimal, base 16, and then E rather, in base 16. So the actual answer is, if we did it properly, would be, what we need to do is 4E. Because you need to combine at the end. These are just separate at the moment, but you need to combine them to actually give your answer. And you can imagine if you had a very long bit pattern, say this was 10 times as long, and you have to convert it to decimal first, then that's not ideal. It's going to take you so much longer if you didn't have a calculator. So instead you can separate it, and you're only dealing with numbers between 0 and 15, so it's a lot easier. For the third part, a student asked why is hexadecimal often used instead of binary, and that person said because it uses fewer digits it will take up less space in the computer's memory. I've got to explain why that student is incorrect. Well, first of all, hexadecimal was used because when you're writing it down it takes up less space. Clearly we've started with this bit pattern here and we've ended up with a much shorter version, so it's divided it by 4. But that's not actually anything to do with the computer's memory. The computer only ever deals with binary. This is just useful for us. Binary doesn't look very appealing to us as humans, but hexadecimal is slightly better and shorter to deal with. But for a computer's memory, it's got nothing to do with hexadecimal. It never uses hexadecimal directly. It's all done in binary. So all data stored in binary, so it would take up the same amount of space. As in, if you're going to represent this hexadecimal number, this would just get converted back to the bit pattern to store it in for memory. We now need to explain how a binary number can be multiplied by 8 by shifting bits for 2 marks. And so a shift is a way of either multiplying or dividing. So when you go to the left, you're multiplying, and when you go to the right, you're dividing. In the same way, if you had 15 and wanted to divide it, or you wanted to make it smaller, you'd go 1.5, i.e. you're shifting it this way to the right. So it's the same way in binary. So to multiply by 8, each time you're shifting in binary, to the right you're dividing by 2, and to the left you're multiplying by 2. So if you want to multiply it by 8, we just need to do 3 shifts. So multiply by 2, by 2, by 2. 2 times 2 times 2 is same as saying 2 times is times 8. So basically we do a left shift, or a left logical shift if you're being correct, a left shift of a left shift of 3. So 1 mark for specifying the direction and 1 mark for saying how far you're going. ASCII is a coding system that can be used to represent characters. In ASCII, the character A is represented by the numeric code 65, and we've got to show which character is represented by the numeric code 70, or shade, sorry. So this is all about knowledge of how the table actually works. So basically they're stored sequentially. So capital A is next to capital B, and so if A is 65, then B is going to be 66, and so we need to go all the way to 70 and work out what 70 is, so by using the alphabet. So if A is 65, then 70 is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Anyway, so it's going to be F. And importantly, you've got to realise that it's capital F, not lowercase f. This is a whole band of capital letters, then it'll be the same for lowercase, but they're separate codes, they're 2 distinct characters in ASCII, so lowercase f is not correct. Unicode is an alternative to ASCII. Describe one advantage and one disadvantage of using Unicode to represent characters instead of ASCII for 2 marks. So very simple, just one advantage, one disadvantage. So Unicode was brought in because ASCII couldn't represent all the characters needed. ASCII only uses 7 bits per character, so you end up with 2 to the power 7 combinations. So there isn't enough to represent barely the English language, let alone other languages. So Unicode's more complicated basically because you kind of pick and choose what you want, but let's say it uses 16. So you can represent, so one advantage is you can represent more characters, and the negative is it takes up more space. More storage space because each character is represented by more bits. The next question is about compression. So data is often compressed. One method that can be used to compress text data is Huffman Coding. To produce a Huffman code, each character in a piece of text is placed in a tree, with its position of the tree determined by how often the character was used in the piece of text. And the tree for Zoe saw a zebra at the zoo is shown here. So we've been told that, let's zoom out a little bit. So the character E would be the bit pattern 110, because where is it? So E is here. So we're going 1, 1, 0. And same with Z. So Z is here. So we're going left, right, left. So 0, 1, 0. And that's how these Huffman trees work. You go 0 for left and 1 for right. It doesn't actually matter because it would be the opposite way around, but this is the scenario they're giving, so that's what we're going to go with. And you're lucky if you haven't had to actually build the tree at this point. It's just giving you it, which is much easier. So we need to find the code for the characters O, space, and B. Remember, space is also a character as well. So what is it? 0, space, and B. So 0 is, and there's 0, O is here, so we're going 1, 1, 1. For space, we are here, so 1, 0. And for B, we are all the way down here, so we're going left, left, right, right, left, which is the same as saying 0, 0, 1, 1, 0. And for part 8, we are told that this can be stored in 83 bits using Huffman Coding, so when it's compressed, we're going to calculate how many additional bits are needed to store the same piece of text using ASCII for 3 marks. So the premise of Huffman Coding is that if you had ASCII, you would use, so ASCII uses 7 bits, as I said, per character. So basically you'd end up with each character having 7 bits allocated, where you don't need them. To make the most efficient representation, you can reduce it to this. Basically you can reduce, all of these are less than 7, so basically we want to work out how many characters are in this. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so there are 26 characters in this, and each represented by 7 bits in ASCII, so we multiply them together. 7 times 6 is 42, 7 times 2 is 14, so this is 182 bits in total for uncompressed, but it does say how many additional bits, so we need to basically subtract, that's a mess of numbers, so 182 minus 83, which is 12 minus 3, so 9, and 7 minus 8, 17 minus 8, so 9, so it's 99 extra bits needed. And obviously you get working marks here, so you want to make it as clear as possible to the examiner what you're doing, but otherwise that would be the full marks. Question 2 begins with telling us that the CPU is one of the hardware components, the most pointless bit of information ever, and we're asked to define the term hardware for a single mark. So the hardware is just the physical components of the system. A member statement used to connect different components in the CPU is a description of which of the following: control unit, bus, ALU, clock, or Ethernet. So if the answer is bus, hopefully that's obvious. Bus is just the technical word for a wire. You can think of it as if it just connects different components and transfers data. The others have nothing really to do with that. The clock regulates buses, but it doesn't. It's not a connection. Now we have a slightly more interesting question. We are asked to explain how main memory is used during the fetch execute cycle. So this is how the CPU actually processes data, as in carries out instructions. So basically the main thing here you need to know, it's for 4 marks, so we need to make a few points here. So we have our instructions in the memory. So the memory is RAM, by the way. and we also have data, and this is called the stored program concept. In fact, you store both instructions and data in the main memory, and the main memory will specifically hold instructions for programs that are currently open. So firstly, instructions are held in memory and are transferred to the CPU during the fetch stage. You then also have the decode stage, but that's not got a whole lot to do with this, to be honest. The decode stage is where you look at the instruction, which might be something like add R1, R2 in assembly, and it'll work out what this is doing, and it'll, warm up the circuitry that is needed to actually execute that. So the execute stage is where any additional information, so say this instruction held it and needed other data, so this is registers, which is on the CPU, but if it had data which it was in main memory as well, because it's stored, as we've said, it needs to get that data as well. So let me read out what I just wrote, because I'm not sure how well I explained it. So any additional data required by the instruction is also held in memory, and it's retrieved if it's needed to execute the instruction. So people sometimes disagree about where this actually occurs. I think of it in terms of the execute stage, but some people think of it in terms of the fetch stage. It doesn't really matter, because CPUs aren't always this. They're not as nice as they are theoretically. So basically, if any additional data is also needed, it will be fetched from main memory, and then also any results may be written to main memory. So it's not super clear where our marks come from, probably from saying that you have the instruction data stored in memory and that they're fetched when needed, and also just writing to memory afterwards. Increasing the amount of cache memory and changing the type of cache memory can improve the performance of the CPU. State 2 other ways of improving the performance of a CPU. So the most obvious are increasing clock speed. So this can be thought of as how frequently it does the fetch execute cycle per second. They're not directly, well, yes, it's basically how fast it will process that cycle. And a second one would be to increase the number of cores. A multi-core processor, say it had 4 cores, is a bit like having a single CPU times 4. So you basically have an individual processor unit with an ALU, with a control unit, and all this stuff. And you've got to be slightly careful with multi-cores, because it's not like if you had 4 cores you have 4 times performance, because most software doesn't actually utilize the 4 cores. Maybe at a time, if you've got a really fancy processor, maybe 10% of the time it's being used to its full potential. The rest of the time your applications aren't making use of it. And anyway, you're never going to get 4 times the amount if you had 4 cores. It's never going to be totally efficient. But cache is a very small store of memory which is used to store frequently accessed instructions because it's that much faster. Basically, in reality, it's either on the chip, so you have a bit of cache maybe, or it's stored in between your RAM and your processor. So you have a bit of cache, and it will check the cache first because it's much smaller, it's much easier to check, and it's faster anyway. And different types of cache are things like L1, L2, L3, and they get, as the numbers go up, they get slower, but they get larger. So there's this hierarchy of cache, and that's what it means by types of cache. Question 3 begins by asking us whether ROM is volatile memory. It's not, it's non-volatile. So volatility is about whether it can retain the data once power is switched off. RAM can't, so RAM is volatile, but ROM can retain its data, so it is not volatile. And secondly, in most desktop computers, there's more ROM than RAM. You might have, you'd have gigabytes of RAM, you might have, megabytes of ROM, really not much. It's often used, this is false by the way, it's often used for booting, so having the bootstrapping application that actually moves the OS into RAM when you start a computer up. It doesn't take up much space, but you need a program to actually do that. So that's what ROM was used for, but even now ROM is being replaced with just flash storage, so it is not really ever used. So the exception to what I just said is embedded systems, which is handily the next question. So most modern washing machines are embedded systems, i.e. they do very specific parts. They have individual, very small computers, which are really what embedded systems are within them, like one will monitor the temperature of the water, one will measure the temperature, measure the weight of your washing, things like that. So very specific, very basic purposes. And normally they have less main memory than non-embedded systems. So we'll describe 2 other likely differences between the main memory for a washing machine and the main memory for a non-embedded system for 2 marks. Not a very fun question. If it makes you feel any better, other exam boards get almost identical questions, so it's not just you. There's always a couple of random questions about things like washing machines. Anyway, so 2 likely differences are basically what they're alluding to is they're more likely to have more ROM than RAM. So I don't really know what RAM would be used for. Basically the instructions, that could be our first point. Basically the instructions would be stored in ROM primarily, or let's say programs are stored. So like I said, it'd be a very, very simple program for the individual component of a washing machine. So programs stored in ROM, they only have to do very simple things and often just on a loop. A third reason, which is less related, is that ROM is often used for secondary storage. So people class it as main memory, which is a little bit confusing because main memory, at least to me, is synonymous with just RAM and not ROM, because like I say, ROM is not really used in our normal systems. So ROM is often be used as storage in very small systems. So if you have like a calculator, it won't have a little hard disk, obviously it's going to have a little chip of ROM that can store whatever it needs to store to work. So often ROM is used as storage, but it does ask about memory as opposed to secondary storage, which is why I didn't put that in my first two. Question 4 begins with a black and white image consisting of 36 pixels, so a width of 6 and a height of 6, so 36 in total. And we need to explain why 36 bits are needed to represent the pixels in the image shown in figure 4. So 36 pixels, 36 bits used. So why is this? Well, first of all, it's black and white, so we only need 2 combinations, so either 0 or 1. So it could be 1 for white and 0 for black. So basically we have 2 colours, so 2 combinations needed. A single bit can accommodate this. So 1 bit per pixel leaves us, or gives us 36 bits. Yeah. Now we need to say how many bits per pixel would need to be used if the image shown had 4 colours instead of 2. So what we're doing up here basically is we're going, okay, so we're in binary, so we've got, in fact let's do it over here. So we're in binary, so our base is 2, and we don't know what this is yet, but we're going to end up with, we need 2 colours basically, so it's black and white. So what is x here? Well, x is going to be 1 here, so 2 to the power 1 is 2, so 1 bit is used. So x here would be how many bits we're using. So basically here we've got, we're doing binary still, so it's base of 2. We've got our value of x, and we need 4 colours instead of 2, so 4 combinations basically. So what is x in this case? Well, x is clearly going to be 2, so that's not relevant, but so basically the answer is 2 bits. And generally speaking, this is how combinations work. So if you were a normal decimal and you were looking at your PIN number or your passcode for your iPhone, you've got 4 digits available. How many combinations is this? Well, there are 10,000 combinations in this case. So very similar idea. And now we need to define the term pixel. So a pixel is the smallest distinguishable feature of an image. Relatively standard, I think. The only mistake people sometimes make is to say that it's a picture element, which is almost never accepted by the exam board, because that's just what pixel comes from, but don't ever write that because I've never seen it be the actual correct answer. Question 5 is about network. So most schools have a network, and some schools allow teachers to access that network from their home computers. Give one reason why they would allow this and one reason why some schools do not allow this. So with these kind of questions, you really want to relate it to the scenario they're giving. They're not just giving that example for no reason. You should really try and relate it. So reason for this is not really a computer science reason, but access students' work so they can mark it. Students' work to mark from home. So this is a totally application question for 4, but against is more a security issue. So ones you could maybe talk about are things like they might have less secure computers, so less secure home computers. No antivirus. They love talking about antivirus examiners. No antivirus software, which means private data is more vulnerable. And obviously we've got to be very careful with private data, especially when it's children, so the Data Protection Act is also relevant, so we've got to be quite careful with how they're actually storing the data. PANs and LANs are 2 different types, and anyway, describe one difference between the 2 for our single mark, and for difference we have to actually mention both sides. We can't just say a LAN is a network over a small area. You've got to compare it to a PAN. So a personal area network and a local area network. So local area networks are things like maybe a school or your house. So over a small network, but a PAN is just around a single person. So that's the most obvious, I suppose. So PAN exists around a single person. So this exists around a single person. So this is things like Bluetooth. Like you might have Bluetooth headphones. Maybe in your car, you're connected to your car's entertainment system, something like that. But you've got to obviously compare it to LAN. And instead of the geographical difference, you could also say that a LAN is likely to be used by many people, or some people at least, rather than just a single person like a PAN. And I didn't even read the next question. We've got to give an example of where a PAN could be used. So I said like in the car, or maybe in the gym if you've got Bluetooth headphones. That's a good example, Bluetooth headphones. I don't know what they mean by example, but you could say just to be complete, in the gym, so as a very basic example. The next part is a 6 marker, and we've got to discuss this statement, which is schools should use a wireless network instead of a wired network. And a discuss question is always interesting. You've got to be very, very wary of what this means. So first of all, this means you've really got to link it to the scenario. So you can't just talk about it in a generic sense. You've got to link it directly to what they give you, the scenario they give you. And also you've got to link your points together. So you can't just have like a distinct, 6 points. You've got to somehow link them together so they're nice and coherent. And it's better to do a little plan, at least in your head, if not just on paper to the side maybe, just so you know roughly what you're going to talk about. Often you'll start an answer and not really know where you're going to go with it. So one of the things we can talk about is security. The previous few questions have been on security, at least a little bit. So a wired network is more secure than a wireless network. A wireless network, anyone can if you're not physically within the school, if you're just outside of the school but still in range, or for Wi-Fi, you can in theory, use the Wi-Fi, and you've got to be a little bit careful about it. Whereas a wired network, you have to actually be physically connected to it, so within the school's boundaries. So security is a point you can mention. Also, it's very easy to add devices to a wireless network. All you need to do is just add another device, but with a wired network, you actually have to physically, connect the device to your network. Which is a bit of a pain and maybe as cost. So those are both positives. No, they're not what we're talking about. So one's a positive for wireless, one's a negative for wireless. And also you could say that performance-wise, wired is usually better than wireless. Once you have loads of people connected to a wireless network, it slows down. The range is quite small potentially. Things like that. So I think really we want to be flipping between a negative to a positive to a negative. Keep it equal on both sides. Another point you could say is that most devices now are wireless only, so often devices in the past would have an Ethernet port as well, like a laptop, but now that's usually not the case. So it allows a more versatility, I suppose, and more availability of devices to use, so tablets and so on, and obviously phones. So I said we're going to try and do 6 distinct points, so we'll try and make use of what we've got here and extend it a little bit. So to start with security first and then try and link it to something else, we could say that wireless networks are more vulnerable as their range may not be limited to the school grounds, whereas wired connections aren't vulnerable externally. So to link it, we could say something like, however, this range means devices can be moved freely about. I'm going to link it to the school situation, e.g. for lessons outside. I don't know how often those happen, but they could happen in theory, lessons outside. The teacher might want to move the laptop outside and things like that. And we could throw in another point now by saying something like, and other devices can be quickly added without the cost or time needed to connect more cabling. So if a school is large and requires lots of bandwidth being how much data you can basically push through the wires or the Wi-Fi at any given point, so you basically use up bandwidth the more people you have connected to it, up until the upper limit of the wire or Wi-Fi. So if the school is large and requires lots of bandwidth, then wired connections are preferential, as their performance is usually better than Wi-Fi. So that's about speed as well, actually. So the only other point I mentioned when we were planning, which I should have really thought about, was the fact that not all devices have a wired connection, so it's probably better if we wanted to link it together. If we put it towards the end, that wouldn't really work. But if we did a little asterisk, so other devices can be quickly added, we could go including devices without wired connections, without wired ports, e.g. tablets. So hopefully you can see how you should really be approaching this discuss type question. You've got to really be linking it directly to the school, even if you give just strange examples. It shows you're considering the scenario at least, and also you've got to make it as coherent as possible. I mean, this is never going to be a brilliant answer that's going to get published in loads of newspapers. You're doing it in basically 6 minutes. It's just basically keeping it relatively coherent, so you're not doing totally distinct points. For part 5, we have a very standard question. We have to define what is meant by a protocol. So two computers on network communicate with each other, they need to use the same protocol. So that's really giving us what the definition is. 2 marks, so 2 parts to this definition. A protocol is a set of rules that allows devices to communicate. Or we could say 2 devices to communicate, but this is a very standard definition. We now have a few multiple choice questions. So which is a protocol here which is used to retrieve email stored on a server? Well, HTTP and HTTPS are about hypertext transferring documents on the web, not relevant. FTP is about transferring data as well. The two bottom ones are two email protocols, so SMTP and IMAP. Well, SMTP is an outbound mail protocol, so you're sending email, which isn't what this is, so that means by definition, by power of reduction, it's IMAP. But A here stands for access. This is Internet Messaging Access Protocol. So the A is access, which is all about retrieving email. So that's what gives it away. Next, we have the same list, and we've got to say which one's used to make a payment securely when purchasing goods from the website. So the S in HTTP stands for secure or security. No one really knows what it stands for exactly, but that's what it does. It's an encrypted version of HTTP. So all about retrieving a document or sending some data across the web, which is what this scenario is. I inadvertently explained this one before, but to send an email from a client machine to an email service for an outbound email, this is SMTP. Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. TCPIP is a protocol stack used in networking, which means it has loads of protocols within it, not just TCP and IP, which are two separate protocols but very important ones. There are 4 layers in the TCPIP stack. We're going to complete the table by placing the 4 layers in order, where 1 is the top layer and 4 is the bottom layer. So we have a conceptual stack of 4 layers in this model. I can't count, there you are, 4 layers. And so at the top you have the application layer. So there's no point doing it there, we might as well do it here. So one of the top layers, so application. And basically when you're sending data, so you can think of it as kind of like the computer at the other side you're transferring to, so sending some data to this thing. You start off at the application at the top, so your application is sending some data. It works its way down the stack, and then once it gets to the other end, it works its way up the stack. And each protocols operate each stack, so TCP is at the transport layer, you have IP at the network layer, which gives the next 2 away. So transport layer is the second top one, so 2, and then network is 3, and then that means data link is 4. So TCP is a protocol that works there, and it will establish the connection. So basically the process is, the application kind of initiates it, you then have TCP which sets up the connection between the two, then you have the IP and things like that, so they address the packet. Then you have your data link, which is actually kind of the hardware, so that's actually how it would be communicated. So maybe this is a fibre optic cable or something like that. So each protocol in this stack does a very specific thing at each layer, and each layer does a single part of the communication process. And now we need to explain the purpose of an operating system for 4 marks, so 4 distinct points here. When it's an explain question, it's relatively straightforward. So the things we talked about in the video were the interface, input-output devices, so I/O devices, processor, that's very important, so processor management and memory management. So that's the 4 points we're going to make. It does other things, of course, as well you could talk about, but those before I think we learned about specifically. So first of all, it creates an interface between the hardware and the user. So interfaces are all about abstraction, really. You've got your hardware and you've got your user, and you want something in between that actually will do the communication between the two. You don't want to be don't want to be interacting directly with the hardware. You want a nice interface in between. It manages memory storage, memory use, and how processes are allocated to the processor or CPU. So some processes are more important than others. It will do things like interrupts. So if a process is doing something, it can trigger an interrupt and stop it. So for example, if you're about to shut your computer down, it will suddenly try and save all your stuff, things like that. And also, what did I said about input-output devices. So trying to think of the right word to use. It handles, or manages, it handles input and output devices, such as by using their device drivers, which are separate pieces of software, but need to be used by the OS drivers in order to work. So 4 points there: interface, memory management, processor management, and input and output devices. Question 7 is specifically on security then. So penetration testing is an attack on its own computer system by an organization to try and find weaknesses. And we need to describe one difference between black box and white box pen testing. And just another exam technique, you've got to mention both sides of this. You can't just say black box is A and then not talk about white box. So black box is where you have no knowledge of how the system works, whereas white box you have the knowledge of how it works, and you have basically some insider knowledge. No knowledge of the system. So you're totally external to it. So you're likely to have brought in an external person to do this, of course, otherwise they know how it works if you work for the company, whereas has it inside the knowledge. And you're likely to do both just to see if there's any difference. Another 6 marker now about social engineering, which is often used to try and gain unauthorized access to a system. And phishing is a commonly used technique of social engineering, where emails are sent to pretend to be from a reputable company in order to try and obtain personal details. So we need to describe another 2 social engineering techniques and explain how, or explain the measures that can be taken to reduce the security risk from phishing and the 2 other ones we mentioned. So different to before because we've got to address 2 separate questions in one. So there are 4 we actually talked about in the video, so 4 you actually need to know in addition, including phishing, but there are others as well. If you've learned that's great, so you can mention them too, but let's just stick with the ones I meant to know. So phishing, and there's also shouldering, blagging, and then there's also farming. So let's go with the first 2 for no particular reason, just because they're first. And farming is where you set up a website which looks like it's a real website, but is a fake website, of course, and gets personal details that way. And to prevent that, you could set up a firewall or web filters and things like that. So let's explain blagging first, which is where you fake scenario setup to persuade a person to give their personal details. The second one, shouldering, is literally just looking over someone's shoulder, pretty much, watching a user enter personal details. Okay, so that's probably only going to be worth 2 marks in total, because they're both relatively simple definitions. In terms of reducing each of them, including phishing as well, we've got to talk about phishing as well, remember. So general things you can mention for social engineering. I mean, training is obviously very important in general for security, not just for social engineering. A lot of this is about being tricked into a certain situation, which could be avoided if you were better trained. Also using things like biometric measures, which are things like fingerprint scanners and retina scanners, things like that, which you can't, fake. Particularly, you've got to use the actual person to get access to our system, which obviously shouldering would be reduced by. So we can mention that for shouldering. Also blagging. So blagging we could say training, shouldering we could say biometric, and phishing we could say filters maybe on email. So we could say generally training teach users to spot such as blagging. Phishing can be reduced with web filters or with email filters, specifically with email filters to block traffic from unknown sources. And shouldering can be reduced by also having private offices or workspaces. So if you don't really want your terminal to be in the middle of your office or in the reception to your office, having private workspaces and biometric passwords, which isn't really what a password is, biometric access, I don't know, that makes sense. I think having private workspaces and biometric passwords can reduce, or will definitely reduce, shouldering. So that in theory should be our 6 marks. We've kind of got, so this will be 2 marks I think, and this we need it to be 4 marks because we want to get 4 marks, of course. So maybe you would want to mention one other. Of that, we've kind of mentioned 2 here. We've mentioned private workspaces, and that's not a highlighter, and password. So that's kind of 2 points there. So that should be our 6 marks in total. Next, we need to calculate how many megabytes there are in 4 gigabytes for 2 marks. And so the scale goes from a bit to 8 bits for a byte, then 1,000 for a kilobyte, and 1,000 for a megabyte, then 1,000 for a gigabyte. So this is gigabyte, this is megabyte, this is kilobyte, and this is byte, and this is bit. So there are 8,000 bits in a kilobyte, to put it that way. It's probably not a good way to say it. But anyway, it's in terms of 1,000 because technically we're using the physics terms, which are in terms of base 10, because that's for decimal, which is what physics use. So when it's in terms of 1,024, this is when it's in terms of base 2. That's a gigabyte. So if you used 1,024 here, you'd probably still get a mark, but that's actually not correct. That's a different unit. So a gigabyte is in terms of 1,000, and it's easier calculation-wise. So this is just going to be 1,000 times 4, so 4,000 megabytes. An SD card is a type of solid-state storage. Show 2 advantages of using this compared to magnetic storage. So solid-state is non-mechanical, which means it hasn't got like a spinning disk like magnetic storage does. It's basically just logic gates put together. So first of all, it makes less noise, it's quieter, it doesn't really make any noise. The disk spinning around does make noise, and also is more robust. If you dropped a hard disk, you're going to be in trouble, whereas if you dropped an SD card, you're not really going to have any damage done. So things like that. Also produces less heat, smaller as well, clearly, things like that. And many modern computers have both an SSD and a magnetic hard disk drive. Give 2 reasons why they have both, instead of just having an SSD on its own. So this is an application question. Hard disks generally have a really high capacity, so in terms of terabytes now, whereas SSDs are still usually quite low, or basically SSDs are much more expensive compared to hard disks. So hard disks allow large amounts of storage, so SSDs are quicker than hard disks, which is why they're used. Allow large amounts. SSDs are faster, so may store the operating system, for example. That's what a lot of them do. So they're much faster, so storing the operating system means you start up your computer a lot quicker, and storing applications on the SSD means they open quicker and so on. But you don't want to pay loads of money, and most people don't want to pay loads of money for a huge SSD. It's better to have both. The hard disk speed isn't too much of an issue for just large amounts of data, like photos and so on. The penultimate question, then, we've got to describe how data is stored on and read from a magnetic hard disk for 4 marks. Let's do a little diagram to describe this then. So we've got, as I said, a disk that spins around, and you've got I'm not sure how I can draw this, but a read-write head, which basically can check whether a part of the disk is magnetized or not magnetized. So that's to read from. It can check whether it's magnetized or not, or the direction of magnetization is a certain way to represent. So one way represents 1 and 1 represents 0, of course it's in binary, and so that the head will move in this direction, so in the kind of X direction, whereas the disk will spin around. So obviously it needs to line up with whatever this with the track, as it's called, and then you have a disk which spins around so it can actually get to the right location on the thing. Okay, so we can't just do a nice little diagram for the examiner, we've got to actually put it into words. So data is stored in binary, which is represented by magnetized regions, so very, very tiny magnetized regions on the disk. So I don't think it's quite as simple as saying it's either magnetized or demagnetized, in the same way that voltage isn't the same as being on and off. It's often like 15 volts and 20 volts representing 0 and 1, so different, I don't really know the technical word here, but magnetization levels of magnetization, different levels that represent either 1 or 0. To store data, the read-write head moves and the disk spins, and it changes the magnetization of the regions. So to read data, it will read, so to go in a bit more detail than perhaps we need to know, if I go back to the disk, let's choose a proper colour. If I go to the disk, you have your tracks, which are kind of the lines going round, so individual lines, and then you have what is known as a sector, which is kind of part of a track, and this is the minimum amount of storage you can have. So you basically fit all what you're storing into, or basically this is a single part of the storage. So when you're reading a whole sector. So to read data, let's go for the right colour. To read data, the relevant sector data is interpreted. So hopefully that makes sense. Data is of course stored in binary, which is got to have 2 values to represent it. So it could be levels of magnetization, it could be direction it's magnetized in, it could be not magnetized. I'm not sure exactly how it's done, but basically the read-write head shuffles back and forth to line up with the correct track, and a little bit of a track is what's known as a sector, like that. And so to read it, it will navigate by spinning the disk as well to get to the correct sector and analyze what each region that is magnetized represents. The final question then is a 9 marker, so that's kind of a culmination of a written exam as a long essay kind of question, and this is about cloud storage, which is fortunately quite a good thing to talk about. So we're going to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of using cloud storage, and we should include an explanation of the reasons for the large growth in recent years and consider any legal, ethical and environmental issues related to the use of cloud storage. So it's similar to the 2 previous questions combined. We've got a discuss part, and we've also got 2 aspects of 2 parts to answer basically. Okay, let's get the first bit out of the way first, so about why there's been a large growth in recent years. So this is to do with both improvements in technology and in terms of compute and consumer preferences. So we could say that in recent years, mobile devices have become more prevalent, so there's greater need able to access files from anywhere or from anywhere with an internet connection. And you might also want to talk about devices becoming more powerful. In fact, you can maybe use Photoshop or quite intensive applications on maybe an iPad, and you want to access files from back home when you're on the train or something like that. Also, I can certainly remember at the start being very skeptical about cloud storage, and I wasn't sure how reliable it would be. I was quite concerned that it would cost a lot and not really protect my data very well. So we could also say consumers trust cloud storage as it has been shown to be reliable, I suppose. That was certainly my doubt at the start. And also fairly affordable, it's not too expensive. So hopefully that's the first one out of the way. Just 2 points which are two different aspects. So this is a more technological reason and this is more a social reason. It's always good to double them up. So that should get our first couple of marks. So now to do the more tricky bit, I suppose. For remaining, 7, maybe even 8 marks we need to actually cover. So let's do a little plan like we did before. Obviously you would do this off to the side somewhere, but I can afford to erase it. So let's go advantages and disadvantages. So first of all, advantages, you can access it from anywhere, but you need an internet connection. So in fact, let's be a little bit careful because we need to include these here. So maybe only let's do one kind of technical reason and then let's do 2 other non-technical reasons. So legally, we could say data privacy. So advantage is, well, we can link this together. So data can be accessed from anywhere, but it needs to be secure. So privacy, there are laws like Data Protection Act, they've got to be very careful for data. Ethically, I suppose, a link to that as well. I'm not sure what else you could say for ethical reasons. Environmentally, it's actually a good thing to have cloud storage. If you can imagine a huge server center, which is owned by Google or Amazon, they need to obviously cool down all their servers. They need loads of cooling and things like that, and they need to have very efficient servers. They don't want to waste loads of money by having inefficient servers that produce loads of heat and so on. So actually they're a lot more efficient for the environment. If you have a single server in your school or work, and that's what you're using to have data, or even in your computer, if you've got a hard disk or several hard disks, they produce a lot more heat and they use a lot more power kind of per unit than a large data center would. So environmentally they're actually better. Maybe ethically we could say the cost. So actually negative, we could say cost, because you're paying often a monthly subscription, whereas so eventually your monthly subscription is going to cost more than it would be to upgrade your hard disk. So maybe that's ethically. If there's a monopoly, so say Google, or say we've basically got a duopoly, which is where you have multiple large companies, and they can very easily increase the prices because there aren't many small cloud providers. They're all very large companies. If they want to increase the prices, there's not a lot we as consumers can do about it. We don't have many other options in the cloud service provider marketplace. So let's do what I didn't do last time and actually work out the order we're going to do this in. So I think first of all, the most obvious one is this. Then we can move, so this is available anywhere, but you need the internet. Then we could say your data, so your privacy. We could say another concern about the cost maybe, and then we can link back to the environment somehow. So let's try and do this. Okay, so cloud storage allows data to be accessed from anywhere. So we haven't really said why that's a good thing. So we could say while this is convenient, the private data is hosted somewhere the user has no control over. So we could say, for example, in a country without appropriate data protection laws. So in some countries, perhaps if you upload data to the cloud server, you couldn't then ask them to remove it, whereas in the UK they'd have to remove it if you asked them to and things like that. So you are protected in more countries than others. You have no control over where the server is actually physically located, or in a server with poor security. This gives a risk that the data will be made public, which is obviously unethical. We need to somehow link it to the other two mentioned, which were cost and environmental. So we could say something like, for improved security, perhaps the cost will be higher, which would affect poorer customers most. But then to wrap it up, we could say, however, for environmental cost, to try and vaguely link that together, environmental cost is less with the highly efficient servers than individual storage would be collectively. So there you are, not the greatest answer I've ever made in my life. I didn't want to spend too long on it because in reality you only ever spend 10 minutes on or something like that. So I don't think you need to worry too much about making a brilliant case, but it's got to be roughly coherent. It's got to make sure you tick off enough boxes that the examiner can be okay with giving you full marks. Basically, you want to make sure they don't have any doubt in their mind that you know what you're talking about and things like that. And you obviously got to cover both sides equally and make sure you take note of what they say in the question, because this is really telling you where the marks are going to come from. So that's it. Thanks a lot for watching. Hopefully it was useful, and well done for getting this far, and good luck.